Welcome to 101. I'm Greg Bassey, your host from the Salisbury Independent newspaper. Today we have a guy I've watched for a lot of years, and he's one of the smartest people I know. He is literally the man behind the curtain in this county, Jack Lenox. Welcome, Jack.
Thank you, Greg. I'm not sure I welcome that introduction, but I do appreciate being here.
Jack, I've watched you for a lot of years at the city council, at the county council. You were the planning and zoning director for both the city and the county. Your predecessor was my hero as a kid, Bill Livingston. He was a good friend of the family, sat there at table with him, talked about these issues forever. Very patient guy. You're an amazingly patient guy. What's it like to do your job when there's so much pressure on what you do in terms of deciding what people can do with their property?
It can get very, contentious at times, but I've been doing this for a long time. I've worked in difficult situations, and I think it's basically understanding your role. Understanding that it's the community, the elected representatives that set the tone to make the policies, and we just try to make sure that all the interests are represented at the same time and just try to keep some balance in all of it.
Now, you go back to the old consolidation days when there was a lot of things about consolidating this with what the city and the county do. So you have to worry about both the city and the county. Is there any conflict in that?
There's potential for conflict, certainly. But I think overall, I look at it more as a common interest than a conflict of interest. The residents of the city are residents of the county, as surprising as that is to some at times. And the city has a definite role, as does the county. And frankly, they have the same constituents. And I work for all of them. So trying to work for the public, and again, there is no one public, and make sure they're all represented and try to keep all sides represented at the table at once. And sure, it can be challenging, but that's the only way that we're ever going to get anything done.
Let's talk about how it's set up. There's a Planning and Zoning Commission, and Charles Chip-DeShiel, the local attorney's the chairman of that. So that's one group of your bosses, sort of.
Yes.
And then there's the Zoning Appeals Board, which is its own kind of interesting group. And I guess you work with them as well.
We have two boards of zoning appeals, one for the city, one for the county.
Right. And then you also have to deal with the actual town governments. There's so many rules about zoning. Shouldn't it be simple, like this property, zone this, and that's just the way it is, and that's it?
I think that when you speak about the Board of Appeals, it's often misunderstood what their role is. I like to think of the Planning and Zoning Commission as the sponsor of some of the zoning rules and regulations. It's not all just about zoning. Zoning is inherently a negative thing. And it grows out historically of sort of nuisance codes, making sure that the junkyard doesn't go next to the single-family home. But zoning only goes so far. That in effect is the stick. So much else has to do with the carrot as well. Now, the role of the Board of Appeals, there's always that escape clause.
Right.
There's a set of rules that work, generally speaking, in most situations, but you want to recognize that the individual is important, that they have rights, that situations vary, and that's sort of the escape clause in there, in the public process, of course, to make sure that individuals are fairly dealt with as well as the community at large.
I watched the Zoning Appeals Board down in Ocean City when I was a kid because my grandfather was on there. And his attitude was, if you own property, you own it hell deep and heaven high, and no one can tell you what to do with it. So the Planning Commission would work really hard on an issue for months and months and months, and then we get to appeals, and he would always vote in favor of the property owner, no matter what. He didn't care what the argument was, which is why, like, if they'd say, no, this building can only be 8 stories, and the developer wanted to make it 20, he would say, make it 20. That was always his route. Is that frustrating for someone like you if you get someone like that on one of your boards or commissions?
I understand that every board member goes into the process trying to do what's right for the community, and it's important that you not have open-ended rules and regulations so that if something does go before a Board of Zoning Appeals, that there's some criteria that goes with it. And at times people think that it's just a good idea, bad idea. And it's not. There are rules, there are regulations, and frankly, if we don't follow them, it can be a very costly legal situation. So that's one of the things we try to do as well, is staffing the boards, providing them with information, and making sure that they do follow those rules. There is a tendency at times, though, for any individual, for any of us, to try to go outside of those bounds, and we try to bring it back together. Mr. DeShield is very good, since you mentioned him as a chairman, trying to keep people on target and understanding that it is a balance between what the community may want at any given time and then what the rules, regulations, and frankly our objectives are.
Right.
You have to keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, Chip chooses his words very carefully, and he's very diplomatic, yet at the same time he's got an authority about him, which is really impressive.
He's got a lot of experience. Chip has been involved, if not the chairman of basically every good organization in our community, and I'm really fortunate. And in fact, when Chip was appointed as chairman, it's a joint appointment. And so to have a mayor and an executive, and then 5 city council members and 7 county council members unanimously confirm him, that's something that not everyone can do.
Right. Now, I run into him all the time, and I'm saying, what's going on? You know, because I'm looking for news stories. And he's always saying, Greg, there's nothing going on. There's nothing happening. But I remember, like, in the late 90s, early 2000s, you were a busy guy. There was so much development. There was so much pressure on you. That hasn't really been going on so much in the last 6 or 7 years. Is it really changed?
A lot of what's happened clearly is the recession. There's a thought that as things get better, and they are getting better, or if you define better as more active, that we will be the first to know. That's not really the case. The person who will be the first to know really is probably the homeowner who's trying to sell their house. The local realtor who can tell you time on market. They will know first as far as the economy is concerned. There's so much inventory out there right now in residential and I believe in commercial space as well, that has to be worked out. Planning Commission tends to see more speculative projects, some of the newer ones. So in terms of the agenda for the Planning Commission, they have been shorter. They're not as long or contentious as they were at one point. But the economy is cyclical, life is cyclical. I think that will come back.
Right. How long have you been director?
Starting my 14th year.
14 years.
Yes,
wow,
sir.
That's amazing. What's the biggest controversy that you've had to face? Was it the old mall property, probably?
You know, they all sort of grow together after a while. Probably the old mall property, which was very contentious at the time. In understanding that there are neighborhoods, both city and county, and that's where that role in terms of both come together pretty well. Because the fact that you're not in the city but you're adjacent to the city, there are many folks who don't live in Salisbury who have a stake here, who have an investment here, and need to be represented.
And that property's right on the line.
Absolutely, absolutely right on the line, and city services and city zoning, but county neighborhoods that have to be represented as well. And they went through an extensive, not just what is a good idea of what should be done with the mall, and extensive market studies, but also legal challenges. And you know, it's something still it's not been totally resolved. We still have a pile of concrete out there waiting for a buyer if anyone is interested, as I understand.
The concrete or the property?
The concrete.
Right.
The property itself is still owned by the same real estate investment trust. You know, it never changed hands. There were some controlling partners involved that were the front of the proposals. But you know, those of us who have money invested in our retirement plans, that it's a long-term investment, and I believe it is for that trust as well.
Right. I remember 15 years ago, Henry Hanna, I was talking to him about the mall. He goes, Greg, that mall's not going anywhere. He goes, there's no landfill to put it in. He goes, if they tear it down, there's just going to be a big pile of rubble there for years and years and years. And I was like, you don't know what you're talking about. And that's exactly
that's what's
the situation now. It's much cleaner than he sort of envisioned it for me. They took everything of value out, but now there's the big pile of stone.
Yes.
Which you would think has some commercial use at some point, but it costs money to move it, I guess.
We would anticipate that when there is a need for, when the economy does improve, when new construction takes up again, there will be a purpose for that. It's been deemed not sufficient as a roadbed.
Right.
So city and or county are not really the possible customer for that.
Right.
But any other larger development or on site when something happens there, it is a fabulous site. in terms of infrastructure. Anyone driving down, it's got the widest roads, it's got the water, the sewer, in a central city location, and something will happen.
Now, someone like you, and this is probably a really unfair thing, but being a smart guy, knowing zoning, knowing property use, probably at the time you thought this plan is fine for this property, and maybe you didn't understand the opposition to it. If I'm thinking, I'm applying this to myself because that's how I felt. So I'm sort of assuming that you felt the same way. The plan made complete sense to me for the location. So when you get in these situations where you might have an opinion like this is probably what's best for the county, are you allowed to advocate that, or do you have to let them decide these things?
We do try to let the process run its course. There is a certain amount of advocacy along the way. But when you're trying to tell a neighborhood, for example, what's best for them, really they have to speak for themselves on that. We have to recognize, again, that the individual in the individual neighborhood, it's their life. It's their backyard, their biggest investment. So we understand that folks are going to look more closely at what's behind their house than it is, someone else's.
Right.
At the same time, we have to recognize that it's human nature. This isn't the only community that I've seen this. Folks come out to oppose something. If things are going well, they generally stay home with their families. But if they oppose something, they come out. So if you have a public hearing and you only listen to the interest expressed at that particular meeting, you are by definition possibly getting a slanted view. So it's up to the Planning Commission, the Board of Appeals, City Council, the elected representatives to recognize what's best for the total community and try to remember that along the way as well.
Recently, you all had it wasn't a public hearing, it was an early hearing before the county council, and some opponents of this big farm out on North Road, West Road, came and protested. And I kind of enjoyed it because I had not seen that kind of a protest from property owners about a development in a long time. As a journalism guy, it's fun for us to watch that stuff. Talk about that situation with that farm and what's going on up there.
Sure. It's not just that one piece of property. It's a situation that is affecting the entire Eastern Shore at this point, and that is the change that's taken place in the poultry growing industry. And we're starting to see a type of agriculture that we have not seen before. And for a county that strives to be the lead in the state in terms of agricultural production, we recognize the importance to the economy, that there are a lot of folks who rely on poultry in various ways for their livelihood and to pay their mortgage. So it's on the one hand, you say, we're in favor of agriculture, we will do anything we can. And then something comes along that, at least by its appearance, is very different than anything we've known before as agriculture.
Right.
Any of us who have purchased homes in the county on the Eastern Shore at times hear the advice, well, look around and see what's in the area, find out what could potentially happen there, and before you make your investment. And if you don't need to want to be next to a poultry house, then look somewhere else. Well, in this case, what's happening is in an area that has not seen this type of development before, that has the appearance more of an industrial park, perhaps.
Right.
And so that issue is still not yet resolved. Again, it's a balance of what is essential for us as a community and as a region, and that's the poultry industry, and then balancing that with quality of life and the environment, and those are all things we have to take into consideration. It's not just Wicomico County. The discussion up on Northwest Road was not a formal hearing. You're right, it was a coming together of the community at public comment.
Right, they were getting the council's ear on this thing early.
Exactly, exactly. Which unfortunately does not, by that particular approach, does not lend itself towards interaction and discussion. So we have to, I know that the county and the county executive particularly are taking this issue on directly, and we'll try to figure out how we should best adapt to changes in agriculture.
It's interesting, as a spectator in all this, like the public comes, they're all upset, they've got great stories, heartbreaking in terms of the reaction to how their lives are going to change.
Sure.
A lot of projected, who knows what's really going to happen, but the council's on the spot, and they have to sit there and they have to seem sympathetic, and I'm sure they are, and they want to balance the rights of the right to farm situation. They want to do what's right for the county. It's so interesting to watch that sort of, not conflict, but the commiseration that goes on in all that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. We all have competing interests in our own lives.
Right.
You know, we need to work. We need to have a place to live. We need to have a place for recreation. We want open space. How do you balance those things? That's my challenge generally, and that's the challenge in that specific situation.
Right. Most boring stuff in the world is coming up here, more discussion on this. The tier maps.
Yes, sir.
I don't understand any of this. And I'm the editor guy. I'm supposed to know this stuff, but I don't. What's it like dealing with the public who doesn't understand it either?
It is very confusing. And I have to say that whether you're in a Democrat or Republican administration in the state, I can get down to a particular way to explain this. And that is that those in Annapolis were not having the influence through the planning and zoning regulations that they were looking for. And they chose to go around them and to use some state authority through, and essentially, the health laws and the septic system laws.
Right.
So what we had discussed previously in terms of, well, can you build homes there? Yes. How many homes can you build? It depends on how much land you have. Now it comes down to a sheer number. No more subdivisions on septic systems greater than 7. And so you have a situation where folks at the state, probably with very good intentions, look to impact local decision making and local autonomy, using the door they had access to, which were the health regulations.
Right. So if you've got a subdivision, it would have to have its own little mini sewer plant, essentially.
If you were to have a subdivision greater than 7, it would have to be on central water and sewer. In Wicomico County, we do not have a county water and sewer system. It's in the municipalities.
Right.
And they guard that very carefully. So those who do not wish to be annexed, who do not wish to tie into municipal water and sewer, are left with that alternative. And oh, by the way, under this law as well, you can't have package plants in a large expanse of the county. So areas near the cities, in what we call designated growth areas, that would still be a possibility.
So that promotes smart growth, basically. The old smart growth plan, the 2020 plan from Schaefer, smart growth with Glendenning, whatever it is now. What's it called now?
It changed.
but the idea is to keep the growth closer to the urban and keep it within the sewer. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And that's a series, and I honestly rarely use the word smart growth because it connotes different things to different people. But there are principles of smart growth that I like to find consensus on. You know, we do want to preserve open space. We do want to make community facilities, provide them in the least, expensive way. And then balance those other needs. You know, what is dense to someone else, to one person, is very different for someone else.
Right.
You know, someone who comes from a city, someone who comes from a suburban environment, would look at it very differently.
Right. Our county executive, when he was running, and a little bit now, he talked about expanding sewer, water and sewer, and having maybe a county system somehow. He asked that question aloud.
Sure.
I don't hear it asked as much lately. Will we ever get to that point? Will the county have a true sewer system? Like right now, it's just Fruitland and the city of Salisbury, as far as I know, around Salisbury.
Delmar.
And Delmar, right, okay. And that's helped Delmar. It's helped Fruitland. And having that sewer has promoted growth. But do you think there will ever be a county system?
That's hard to say. There's been a lot of interest through the years. It wasn't simply Executive Culver, Executive Pollitt, looked into that as well. I know the Greater Salisbury Committee, as advocates for smart growth, have looked into that as well. I think we find out that it is extremely expensive, and it's something that, with other financial constraints, would be very difficult to take on. Clearly, though, there is a public role in this. The days of building individual package treatment plants, as we talked about earlier, and just wishing people well in terms of running them, those days are behind us.
Okay.
So there will be added constraints both by Maryland Department of the Environment, by the county if we get to that point for some oversight. Whether the county will actually own a system is very speculative at this point.
Well, could they take over Fruitland, Delmar's, Salisbury's, and create a sewer commission?
I suspect that the cities and towns that have invested in those facilities would be looking for compensation. We can always, though, find better ways of dealing with one another and working with each other and understanding, back to the initial question, it's not really a conflict of interest, it is a common interest.
Right.
So what happens in our rural areas affects Salisbury. The strength of downtown and the city as a whole affect our rural areas. We have to recognize those common points.
Right. The city boundaries are an incredible issue in Salisbury.
They look like this.
Right. Someone said it looks like a
Yes.
big pile of broken glass. The
Yeah.
way, does it matter? Is it going to change? Do we need to annex the Tony tanks to have a better cohesion in terms of where the lines are?
I think that when we find, again, not to beat this too much, but the common interests, there are times when it makes sense for a neighborhood to want to be part of the city, and times when they do not see that self-interest in joining the city.
Where I grew up in the Johnson Lake area, Kipling Drive, Whitman Avenue,
Sure.
you had to drive through the city to get to a little island in the county.
Sure.
We never had any snow, no snowplow ever came
Right.
into that part of the county where
Right.
we lived. We just
Right.
waited for spring.
I think that there are, being optimistic here, I think we see some real advantages, and I know that Executive Culver and Mayor Day would have to speak to you about this
Right.
directly. They do have common interests in county neighborhoods that are struggling with failing septic systems.
Yeah.
And a city that has a facility that can support that. Recognize if a neighborhood is brought into the city, that brings city obligations as well. It means responses to the police department and road maintenance. And so it's not just, this is great, let's get some tax revenue. There are responsibilities that go with that as well. And so they have to measure those things. In the end, if you ask me the question, does it matter? It does matter. And I would suggest that to the individual citizen out there, those of us on the inside, we know where those lines are. Citizens don't. They want services. They want to make sure that they get the sort of support that they need when problems arise. They don't care who fills the pothole. They don't care if it's a state road, a county road, a city road. They want it fixed. And that same principle applies to a lot of things. So we need to be at the table, because as I've said on other occasions, whoever's not at the table is going to get blamed.
Right.
So we all have to be at the table
Right.
together, and we have to keep working towards those common interests.
What's our future? What future do you want to see in terms of growth and development for our county and city?
I think that if you avoid extremes, clearly none of us thought that this recession was going to last as long or go as deep as it has.
Yeah.
On the other side, the years just before that, some faulted for being too extreme, too active, growth happening too fast, and that's very real as well. I think moderate growth, progressing on all fronts in a way that we can keep up with facilities and services, to recognize that there are two sides to the ledger.
Yeah.
That if homes are being built, those are more children in the school, there are more roads to maintain, and we have to do that in a way that's rational.
More affluent going into the bay.
And that we can plan for.
Yeah.
It's not all or nothing. And if we ever pick that in regards to the bay, again, whoever's not at the table is the one that's going to have their fingers pointed at. So stormwater, septic systems, our agricultural community, it all comes together simultaneously.
He's got the hardest job that I know of in our county, in our community, our city. He's Jack Lenox. Thank you, Jack, for being here today.
Thank you very much, Greg. I appreciate it.
Another edition of 101, Greg Bassett from the Salisbury Independent newspaper, here on PAC 14.
First Shore Federal is proud to support PAC 14 and one-on-one. We'd encourage every business to support PAC 14 and pick a program and support it, and let's make a difference.